Ezekiel Carter walked into Halston Bank carrying only a sack. To Richard Halston, he was nothing more than a tired old black man, just another nuisance cluttering up the polished lobby. The marble floors reflected laughter as clerks smirked and customers whispered, amused when Ezekiel calmly declared the bank belonged to him. Security shoved him hard, dragging him toward the street as mocking voices rose in chorus. Their cruelty echoed, certain they had crushed a fool's delusion. But behind Ezekiel's quiet eyes lay something none of them imagined. What began as laughter in that glittering lobby would not end in laughter because they had just mocked the wrong man. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Chase branch in downtown Atlanta, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. The lobby hummed with activity as customers shuffled in line and tellers counted money behind their stations. A middle-aged white woman in an expensive blazer adjusted her pearl necklace, her manicured fingers fidgeting with the clasp as she watched the entrance. "Did you see that strange old man outside?" she whispered to another customer. "He's been pacing back and forth for 10 minutes. The security guards straightened their postures, hands reflexively moving to their belts as the heavy glass doors slowly opened. The whispers grew louder as Ezekiel Carter stepped inside. His weathered brown coat, patched in several places, hung loose on his thin frame. A frayed burlap sack was slung over his shoulder, its rough fabric worn smooth in spots from years of use. Ezekiel's shoes, cracked and dusty, made soft shuffling sounds against the floor as he moved forward. His face, lined with age and wisdom, remained composed despite the growing chorus of snickers and pointed fingers. A young mother pulled her child closer, while a businessman in an expensive suit made a show of checking his watch and rolling his eyes. "Look at that bag," someone muttered. "Probably full of aluminum cans." The security guards exchanged glances, their hands now resting openly on their weapons. Behind the teller counter, several employees stopped their work to stare. A young teller named Mariah watched with growing discomfort as her co-workers shared knowing smirks. Ezekiel reached the center of the lobby, his presence commanding attention despite his humble appearance. He stood straight, his dignity evident in his bearing, and looked around the room with clear, intelligent eyes. The murmurs continued, growing louder as he adjusted the sack on his shoulder. "This bank," he announced in a voice that carried across the marble floor, "is mine." For a moment, silence fell over the lobby. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter erupted from every corner. The woman with the pearls covered her mouth with one hand, her shoulders shaking with barely contained mirth. A group of young professionals near the deposit slip counter didn't bother hiding their amusement, pointing and guffawing openly. "Did you hear that?" a man in a pinstripe suit called out. "He thinks he owns Chase." More laughter followed. Richard Halston, the branch manager, emerged from his office, his face flushed with anger. He was a tall man with carefully styled gray hair and an expensive tailored suit that screamed authority. His shoes clicked sharply against the floor as he approached Ezekiel. "Sir," Halston said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He gestured to the security guards, who began moving forward. Ezekiel didn't flinch. "I have documentation," he began, but Halston cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Documentation?" Halston's voice rose, playing to his audience. "The only documentation you need is the exit sign." Several customers chuckled at this, emboldening him further. "Security, please remove this individual from the premises." The guards approached Ezekiel from both sides, their faces stern. One reached for his arm, but Ezekiel pulled away with surprising agility. "You're making a mistake," Ezekiel said calmly, even as the guards grabbed his arms. "I can prove "The only mistake," Halston interrupted loudly, "was letting you through the door. We don't serve your kind here." A collective intake of breath followed his words. Some customers looked uncomfortable, but most continued to watch with amused interest as the guards began forcibly moving Ezekiel toward the exit. "Your kind?" Ezekiel repeated softly, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "And what kind would that be, Mr. Halston?" The manager's face reddened further. "The kind who doesn't know their place," he snapped. "The kind who comes in here making ridiculous claims and disturbing honest customers." Mariah, the young teller, watched with growing horror as the guards roughly pushed Ezekiel toward the doors. His coat pulled tight across his shoulders as they manhandled him, but he never lost his composure. His eyes remained steady, his back straight, even as his dignity hung by a thread. The woman with the pearls smirked as Ezekiel was pushed past her. "Some people," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "just don't know when they're not wanted." The lobby had become a theater of cruelty, with Ezekiel at center stage. Phones appeared in hands, recording the spectacle. A few teenagers near the ATM snickered and pointed, while business professionals pretended to be absorbed in their phones, occasionally glancing up to watch the scene unfold. The security guards tightened their grip on Ezekiel's arms as they neared the exit. His sack shifted precariously on his shoulder, but he managed to keep hold of it, despite their rough handling. Halston followed behind, his face a mask of smug satisfaction as he watched the old man being removed from his domain. "And don't come back," Halston called out, straightening his tie. "The next time, we'll have you arrested for trespassing." The guards pushed Ezekiel toward the glass doors, their reflections multiplying the humiliation for all to see. The morning sun that had earlier warmed the lobby now seemed harsh and exposing, highlighting every patch on his coat, every frayed thread of his sack, every line on his dignified face as he was forced toward the exit. The security guard's grip tightened on Ezekiel's arms as they marched him across the lobby. His worn shoes scraped against the polished marble floor, leaving faint marks that seemed to trace his path of humiliation. One guard, a burly man with a crew cut, yanked particularly hard, causing Ezekiel to stumble. "Careful with that bag of his," sneered Halston, following close behind. "Wouldn't want him dropping his collection of trash in my lobby." The frayed burlap sack swung precariously from Ezekiel's shoulder as he tried to maintain his balance. His weathered fingers clutched the rough fabric, but the guard's rough handling made it difficult to keep his grip. A young executive in an expensive suit stuck out his foot slightly, not enough to trip Ezekiel outright, but enough to make him stumble again. "Watch your step," the executive said with a smirk, drawing chuckles from nearby customers. The second guard, shorter but just as forceful, pulled Ezekiel's arm at an awkward angle. The sudden movement caused the sack to slip from his shoulder. Ezekiel reached desperately to catch it, but the guard's grip prevented him from reaching far enough. The sack hit the floor with a heavy thud, its contents spilling across the marble in a fan of yellowed paper. The laughter in the lobby died instantly. Instead of the expected pile of garbage or aluminum cans, pristine documents spread across the floor. Thick, cream-colored paper, aged to a rich yellow, bore official seals and ribbons. Notary stamps in faded red ink marked corners of contracts. Gold embossing caught the morning light, throwing small sparkles across the marble. "What in the world?" someone whispered. The woman with the pearl necklace leaned forward, her eyes widening as she recognized the official seal of the state of Georgia on one of the documents. A businessman who had been laughing moments before adjusted his glasses, squinting at the dates visible on some of the papers, dates from decades ago. Mariah Daniels, the young teller who had watched the scene with growing unease, stepped out from behind her counter. She knelt down and picked up one of the documents that had slid near her station. Her dark fingers trembled slightly as she held the paper up to the light. "This is a property deed," she said, her voice clear in the suddenly quiet lobby. "It's got Mr. Carter's name on it, Ezekiel Carter." Halston's face flushed darker than before. "Put that down immediately," he snapped, striding toward her. "That's nothing but garbage. Probably fake documents he printed at the library." But Mariah's eyes stayed fixed on the paper, taking in the official notary seal, the careful calligraphy, the unmistakable signs of age. "This is real," she said, looking up at Halston. "This paper is at least 50 years old. You can't fake that kind of aging." "I said, put it down!" Halston's voice cracked with anger. He snatched the document from her hands, crumpling it slightly in his grip. "Get back to your station before you find yourself looking for new employment." Other customers had drawn closer, their phones now recording the scattered documents instead of Ezekiel's humiliation. A retired banker, his silver hair neatly combed, bent down to examine another paper. "These are bank documents," he said, his professional experience evident in his tone. "Original ones, by the look of them. And that's definitely the old Chase seal." The guard's grip on Ezekiel had loosened in their surprise, but they still held his arms. Ezekiel remained calm, his eyes steady, as he watched people discover the truth of his words. Without speaking, he slowly knelt down, forcing the guards to either let go or bend with him. They chose to release him, stepping back uncertainly. "Sir," one of the guards said to Halston, "Maybe you should do your job." Halston cut him off. He turned to the lobby at large, his voice rising with authority. "This is clearly an attempt at fraud. These papers could be printed by anyone with a computer and some basic design skills." Ezekiel moved methodically, gathering his documents one by one. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Each paper he picked up was carefully smoothed and returned to his sack. The lobby watched in tense silence, broken only by the sound of approaching sirens. Through the glass doors, 2 police cars could be seen pulling up to the curb, their lights flashing. Halston's face showed relief at their arrival. "Finally," he said. "Now we can deal with this properly." Ezekiel continued collecting his papers, seemingly unconcerned by the approaching officers. As he reached for the last document, something small and metallic glinted in his hand. A brass key, its surface darkened with age, caught the morning light. The metal was worn smooth in places from years of handling, its teeth still sharp and precise despite its obvious age. He gripped the key firmly, his dark fingers contrasting with the aged brass. Rising slowly to his feet, sack once again secure on his shoulder, Ezekiel lifted his eyes to meet Halston's gaze. His expression remained composed, dignified, showing neither fear nor anger despite the morning's humiliation. The police officers reached the doors, their uniforms casting shadows through the glass. Halston's triumphant smile grew as he gestured for them to enter, but Ezekiel's grip on the key never wavered. He stood his ground, his weathered face serene, as if he held not just a key in his hand, but the power to unlock decades of hidden truth. The brass key caught the morning sunlight, its worn surface telling stories of decades past. Ezekiel held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting everyone in the lobby see it clearly. The metal seemed to glow with an inner light, drawing all eyes to its ancient form. "This," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying quietly but firmly through the now silent lobby, "is the master key to the original vault, the one installed when this bank first opened its doors in 1963. The 2 police officers paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene before them. One reached for his belt instinctively, but the other raised a hand, signaling him to wait. The tension in the room had shifted. Something wasn't quite right about this supposed trespasser. Halston's face went pale for a split second as his eyes fixed on the key. Recognition flashed across his features before he could hide it. His hand twitched, as if fighting the urge to grab the key himself. But just as quickly, he forced a laugh, though it came out sharp and brittle. "That's ridiculous," Halston said, straightening his tie. "That's probably just some old key he found at a flea market. Security, please remove this man's belongings for evidence." One of the guards stepped forward, reaching for the key, but Ezekiel smoothly tucked it into his coat pocket. "The vault was manufactured by Mosler Safe Company," he continued calmly. "Serial number 847392. Installed on March 15, 1963, by technician James Wilson. The combination was set to your father's birthday, Thomas, February 12, 1925. Halston's fake smile vanished. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. A few customers exchanged glances, phones still recording. The retired banker who had examined the documents earlier stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Those are very specific details," the banker said. "Details that would be hard to research without inside knowledge." "This is absurd," Halston snapped, but his voice had lost some of its authority. He turned to the police officers. "Officers, this man is trespassing. He's disrupting business and harassing our customers with these ridiculous claims." The taller officer stepped forward, hand resting on his belt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." Mariah stepped forward again, clutching another document she had quietly retrieved from the floor. "Officers, wait. These papers look legitimate. Shouldn't we at least—" "Miss Daniels!" Halston's voice cracked like a whip. "One more word, and you can collect your final paycheck." The young teller flinched, but didn't step back. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her ground, the document still firmly in her grip. Several customers had their phones trained on her now, capturing her small act of defiance. "He's claiming ownership of a major bank branch," Halston continued, addressing the officers. "This is clearly an attempt at fraud. I want him arrested." The officers moved forward, their shoes clicking on the marble floor. Ezekiel didn't resist as they took his arms, more gently than the security guards had. His dignity remained intact, his back straight, his eyes steady. "The key still works," Ezekiel said quietly, looking directly at Halston. "You know it does. Just like you know who I am and what your father did." Halston's face darkened. "Get him out of here. And confiscate that bag of forgeries." "The bag stays with me," Ezekiel said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel that made the officers pause. "Unless you have a warrant, those documents are my legal property." The retired banker stepped forward. "He's right, officers. Without a warrant, you can't take his possessions. Basic property law." Halston looked like he might explode, but he couldn't argue with the legal fact. The officers nodded, allowing Ezekiel to keep his sack as they guided him toward the door. The crowd parted, their phones following his progress. Some faces showed confusion, others shame at their earlier mockery. As they reached the glass doors, Ezekiel turned his head slightly. "You've just thrown out your owner," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed lobby. "Remember this moment, Mr. Halston. Remember it well." The officers pushed through the doors, leading Ezekiel out into the bright morning sun. Traffic noise rushed in as the doors opened, the sounds of the city providing a stark contrast to the tense silence inside. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the police presence and the scene unfolding through the glass walls. More phones appeared, recording as the officers released Ezekiel on the sidewalk. He adjusted his coat, settled his sack more comfortably on his shoulder, and began walking away with measured steps. No stumbling now, no uncertainty, just the steady pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Inside, Mariah pressed her hand against the window, watching him disappear into the crowd. Her other hand still clutched the document, her knuckles white with tension. She barely noticed the tears that had formed in her eyes, but she couldn't miss the way her heart hammered in her chest. Something profound had just happened, something that wouldn't simply fade away with the morning's gossip. Behind her, Halston barked orders, trying to restore normalcy to his lobby. "Back to work! Show's over! Security! Clear these people out if they're not here for business!" But normalcy seemed out of reach. Customers whispered among themselves, phones shared footage, and the morning's events rippled outward through social media. The truth, like the morning sun outside, had begun to shine through the cracks in Halston's carefully maintained facade. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Atlanta sidewalks as Ezekiel Carter walked steadily toward home. His worn shoes clicked against the concrete, the rhythm matching his heartbeat. The frayed sack hung heavy on his shoulder, filled with the weight of decades of truth. A red pickup truck roared past, the driver leaning on his horn. "Get off the street, old man!" someone yelled from a passing car. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, survived worse. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his stride unwavering. The viral videos from the bank were already spreading. People on the street pointed and whispered. Some pulled out their phones to take more pictures of the crazy old man who claimed to own a bank. A group of teenagers on the corner snickered as he passed. "Hey, mister!" one called out. "Which bank you gonna buy next?" Ezekiel turned the corner onto a quieter street, leaving the mockery behind. The neighborhood changed quickly. Pristine office buildings gave way to older apartments. Clean sidewalks became cracked concrete. His world. The real world, away from the marble floors and polished brass of downtown. He climbed the worn stairs to his third-floor apartment, each step deliberate. The key scraped in the lock, not a fancy brass vault key, just a simple door key that stuck sometimes. Inside, the afternoon light filtered through thin curtains, illuminating walls lined with cardboard boxes and filing cabinets. To anyone else, the small room might have looked cluttered, maybe even obsessive. But every box, every file, every yellowed paper had its place in the story. Decades of evidence, carefully preserved. Ezekiel set his sack down beside a box labeled 1963 Original Documents. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Ezekiel kept everything clean, organized. A single bed sat in one corner, neatly made. A small kitchen area occupied another, the counters spotless. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center, its surface clear except for a lamp and today's morning paper. He sank into one of the chairs, his bones aching from the day's confrontation. The room darkened as clouds passed over the sun, and his mind drifted back to that spring morning in 1963. "This is going to change everything, Thomas." Young Ezekiel stood in an empty storefront, plans spread across a makeshift table. He was wearing his best suit, the one he'd saved 3 months to buy. A bank that serves everyone, treats everyone with respect. Thomas Halston nodded, his blonde hair catching the sunlight. "First integrated bank in the state. It's revolutionary, Zeke." He clapped Ezekiel on the shoulder. "Your business sense and my family connections, we can't fail." They'd met at a real estate seminar where Ezekiel was the only black attendee. Thomas had been different from the others, had seen past color to recognize Ezekiel's sharp mind for business. Together, they drafted plans for a new kind of bank. The memory shifted, blurred, reformed. 6 months later, the bank was open, successful. But something had changed in Thomas's eyes when he looked at Ezekiel. The warmth had gone cold. "Be reasonable, Zeke." Thomas's voice echoed across his mahogany desk. "The other banks won't work with us if they know you're co-owner. The board members are threatening to pull out. Think of the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" Ezekiel's hands gripped the chair. The bigger picture was changing things, making them right. Or was that just talk? Another shift. Late night at the bank. Ezekiel discovering the forged documents, his name erased, ownership transferred. Thomas's signature on everything. Legal tricks and loopholes exploiting laws designed to keep black men powerless. "You can fight it," Thomas said, not even bothering to deny it. "But who will the courts believe? A respected businessman from an old family, or—" He let the words hang. Ezekiel had walked out that night, dignity intact, but heart shattered. He'd built another life, quietly. Real estate investments, oil rights, community projects. He'd learned to work within the system while gathering evidence, building his case, waiting. The memory faded as the clouds parted, late afternoon sun streaming through the window. Ezekiel blinked, returning to the present. His joints protested as he stood, moving to the small kitchen area. He couldn't afford to get lost in the past. Not now. Not when he was finally ready to act. He warmed up a pot of beans on the hot plate, cut a piece of cornbread from yesterday's batch. Simple food. Good food. Food that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, of lessons learned at her table about dignity and perseverance. The lamp on the table cast a warm circle of light as darkness crept into the room. Ezekiel ate slowly, methodically, the brass key from the bank vault sitting beside his plate. Its surface caught the lamplight, throwing odd shadows across the worn wooden table. Each bite of cornbread took him back, to childhood suppers, to meals shared with Thomas when they were planning the bank, to countless solitary evenings spent building his case. The beans were warm and filling, the cornbread sweet and crumbly. Simple pleasures, but his own. His phone buzzed suddenly, vibrating against the table. The screen lit up with an unknown number, casting blue light across the brass key. Ezekiel paused, spoon halfway to his mouth, watching the phone dance across the wooden surface as it continued to ring. Ezekiel stared at the buzzing phone, his weathered hand hovering above it. The blue glow pulsed in rhythm with the vibrations, casting shifting shadows across his simple dinner. He rarely got calls these days. Most of his old friends were gone, and his lawyers knew to use email. The phone continued its insistent dance across the wooden surface. Through the window, the last rays of sunset painted Atlanta's skyline in deep oranges and purples. Traffic sounds filtered up from the street below, a constant urban lullaby he'd grown used to over the years. His fingers closed around the flip phone. Not one of those fancy smartphones everyone carried now. He believed in things that lasted, things you could trust. The plastic was worn smooth from years of handling, the hinge loose but reliable. He let it ring once more, studying the unknown number. In his experience, surprise calls rarely brought good news, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the events of the day. Maybe it was decades of waiting finally coming to a head. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he flipped it open. "Hello?" His voice was steady, controlled, just as it had been in the bank earlier. "Mr. Carter?" A young woman's voice, hesitant but determined. "This is Mariah Daniels, from the bank today. The teller who picked up your document." Ezekiel's free hand moved to the brass key on the table, fingers tracing its worn edges. "Yes, Miss Daniels. I remember." How could he forget? She'd been the only one who'd shown a flicker of doubt, a moment of humanity. "I'm so sorry about what happened today," she rushed on, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back. "The way they treated you, it wasn't right. None of it was right." Ezekiel closed his eyes, remembering her face as she'd read the document. Young, yes, but with eyes that saw truth. "Thank you, Miss Daniels, but I suspect you didn't call just to apologize." A pause on the line. He could hear the subtle sounds of evening traffic in the background, suggesting she was outside, maybe walking home from work. "No, sir, I didn't." Her voice grew stronger. "I saw those papers you had. really saw them. The dates, the seals, your name. They were real, weren't they? What makes you think that? He kept his tone neutral, decades of caution hard to shake. I've been at the bank 6 months now. I process documents every day. Mortgages, loans, titles. I know what genuine papers look like, especially old ones. And sir, yours were genuine. Ezekiel's fingers tightened on the key. In the growing darkness of his apartment, memories swirled, signing those original documents, the weight of the pen, the hope of that moment. You could lose your job for making this call, Miss Daniels. I know. No hesitation in her voice now. But I couldn't just go home and pretend today didn't happen. Those documents, they tell a story, don't they? A story nobody wants told. Through the window, city lights were blinking on, a constellation of electric stars. Ezekiel stood, moving to look out at the city he'd spent a lifetime watching, waiting. Why do you care about an old man's story, Miss Daniels? Because it's not just your story, is it? It's bigger than that. It's about— She paused, choosing her words carefully. It's about things that should have been different. Things that still need to change. The sincerity in her voice touched something in him, a reminder of his own youth, his own burning desire to make things right. He heard paper rustling on her end of the line. I'd like to hear your story, Mr. Carter. Really hear it. Would you be willing to meet? Talk about what really happened? Ezekiel turned from the window, looking at the boxes lining his walls. Decades of evidence, waiting for the right moment, the right ally. It's not a pleasant story, Miss Daniels. I didn't expect it would be, sir. Another pause. But it's a story that needs to be told. He moved back to the table, sat down in the pool of lamplight. The brass key gleamed, a silent witness to his decision. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I believe it does. Across town, in his wood-paneled office at the bank, Richard Halston paced behind his desk. His fingers drummed against his cell phone as he waited for the call to connect. The sun had set, but he hadn't bothered turning on the lights. The darkness suited his mood. Sir? His voice cracked slightly when the line connected. Yes, I know it's after hours. We have a situation. He glanced at the bank's logo on the wall, the Halston name prominent in the design. That crazy old man who came in today? He had documents, old ones. He listened, jaw clenching. No, sir, I couldn't see them clearly. But, he swallowed hard, he had the key, the original vault key. My grandfather's key. More listening, his face growing paler. Yes, sir, I understand the implications. If he has proof— He wiped sweat from his forehead. What do you want me to do? The answer made him sink into his chair, the leather creaking in the empty office. Yes, sir. Whatever it takes. We can't let this get out. The bank's reputation, the family name— Yes, sir. I understand. Back in his apartment, Ezekiel leaned back in his chair. The phone call with Mariah ended. The lamp cast a warm glow over his simple dinner, now gone cold. His eyes moved across the boxes of evidence, each one a chapter in this long story. It begins again, he whispered to himself, his voice barely disturbing the evening quiet. Morning light streamed through the grimy windows of Lou's diner, catching dust motes that danced in the air. The place smelled of coffee and yesterday's grease, a comforting aroma that hadn't changed in 30 years. Ezekiel sat in a worn vinyl booth near the back, his cup of coffee sending wisps of steam into the quiet air. He'd chosen this spot carefully, close to the bus station, easy for Mariah to find, but far from the bank's usual territory. The breakfast crowd had thinned, leaving only a few regulars nursing their cups at the counter. A waitress wiped tables with mechanical precision, the squeak of her cloth marking time like a metronome. The bell above the door chimed. Mariah stepped in, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. She wore simple work clothes, a pencil skirt and blouse, but her shoulders were tense, her movements careful. Her eyes scanned the diner until they found him. Ezekiel watched her approach, noting how she checked over her shoulder twice before sliding into the booth. Smart girl. Cautious. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low. "Thank you for meeting me." He gestured to the coffee pot on the table. He'd asked for an extra cup when he arrived. "Help yourself, Miss Daniels. No need to whisper. Just folks having breakfast here." Her hand shook slightly as she poured, coffee sloshing against the white ceramic. "I almost didn't sleep last night," she admitted. "Kept thinking about those papers, about what happened, about why someone would—" She trailed off, looking down at her cup. "Why someone would throw an old black man out of his own bank." Ezekiel finished for her. His voice held no bitterness, just a steady certainty. "That's a story that goes back further than you've been alive, Miss Daniels." The waitress approached, pad ready, but Ezekiel waved her off with a gentle smile. When she was gone, he reached into his jacket, a better one than yesterday, though still modest, and pulled out a thin manila folder. 1963, he said, opening the folder. "I had a vision for a different kind of bank, one that would serve everyone, not just those who already had money." He slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. "I had money from my father's real estate business, and Thomas Halston, Richard's grandfather, had the connections." Mariah studied the clipping. It showed two men standing before a building, one black, one white, both smiling. The headline read, "New Bank Opens Downtown." "That's you," she breathed, touching the photo gently. "Yes, young man with big dreams." Ezekiel sipped his coffee. "Thomas and we built something special. Or we started to. 6 months in, papers started disappearing. My signature got removed from documents. Money moved in ways I hadn't approved." He produced another document, a bank statement from 1964. By then, the climate had changed. Civil rights making people nervous. Thomas started getting pressure from his friends, his family. Started talking about how it wasn't proper for someone like me to have such authority. Mariah's hands clenched around her cup. "He stole it from you. Piece by piece. Used every trick in the book. Made it look like I'd mismanaged funds. Forged papers showing I'd sold my shares. By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late. The bank was his, and I was just another angry black man making accusations." The morning light had strengthened, casting long shadows across their booth. Ezekiel pulled out more papers, property deeds, oil rights, investment portfolios. "But I didn't disappear. Didn't die bitter like they expected. I built, quiet-like. Property here, mineral rights there. Made my money work in ways they never noticed. Kept every scrap of paper, every proof of what was mine." Mariah leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "And now? Now?" Ezekiel's smile held decades of patience. "Now the time's right. That key you saw opens more than just the old vault. Opens a box of truths they thought were buried. But I need someone on the inside, someone who can access records without raising alarms." "Me?" Her voice wavered between excitement and fear. "You showed kindness when it wasn't easy. Showed courage making that call." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. "Copy of the original deed. Keep it safe. If anything happens to my copies." Mariah's hands trembled as she took the envelope, tucking it quickly into her purse. "They'll fight back when they realize what you're doing." "Already are." Ezekiel's eyes crinkled with knowing. "Richard Halston was on the phone to his bosses before I reached my apartment yesterday. Man that scared makes mistakes." A bus rumbled past outside, its shadow sweeping through the diner. Mariah straightened her shoulders, determination replacing fear in her eyes. "I'll help you. Whatever you need. This isn't right. What they did. What they're still doing. Ezekiel studied her face, seeing the same fire he'd once had, the same need to make things right. It won't be easy. Might cost you that job you worked so hard for. Some things matter more than a job, Mr. Carter. She met his gaze steadily. My grandmother used to tell me stories about men like you. Men who built things, made things better, then had them taken away. I won't stand by and watch it happen again. He gathered his papers slowly, deliberately. Best head out separately. You first. Bus should be coming soon. Take the back door. Mariah stood, clutching her purse with its precious cargo. I'll start looking through the old records today. Carefully. As she walked toward the back exit, Ezekiel watched her go, feeling a weight lift that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Sometimes, he thought, justice needed young hands to help it along. Through the front window, sunlight glinted off something across the street. Two men in dark suits stood by a black sedan, one holding something that caught the light again, a camera lens. They weren't even trying to be subtle. Ezekiel sipped his coffee, letting them take their pictures. Let them see an old man at breakfast. Let them think they knew what was coming. The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked sidewalks of Pine Hills, where Ezekiel walked with unhurried steps. His worn shoes scraped against concrete that had seen better days, much like the neighborhood itself. Children playing double dutch paused their game, whispering and pointing as he passed. That's him, from TikTok, one girl said, her braids bouncing as she nudged her friend. My mama said he's crazy, another child responded, but there was uncertainty in her voice. Ezekiel kept walking, his face calm despite the attention. A group of teenagers lounged on their front steps, phones held up as he approached. He could hear the tinny audio from their screens, his own voice saying, "This bank is mine," followed by mocking laughter. Mrs. Johnson, who'd run the corner store for 30 years, waved him over. "You're all over my grandson's phone, Zeke," she said, concern creasing her weathered face. "They making you out to be some kind of fool." "Let them talk, May," he replied, accepting the cold bottle of water she pressed into his hands. Truth doesn't need defending, just needs time. Inside the store, a small TV mounted in the corner was tuned to a local news channel. Ezekiel watched as shaky cell phone footage played, himself being pushed out of the bank, papers scattering. The anchor's voice carried a hint of skepticism. The incident at downtown's Chase branch has sparked heated debate. While some dismiss the elderly man's claims as delusional, others point to the historical pattern of black business owners being stripped of their assets. A panel of experts appeared, talking over each other. One, a silver-haired financial analyst, scoffed. The idea that someone could secretly own a major bank branch without anyone knowing is simply absurd. Another panelist, a black historian, countered, "Actually, during the mid-20th century, there were numerous cases of African-American entrepreneurs being forcibly removed from their businesses through both legal and illegal means." Mrs. Johnson shook her head, turning down the volume. "My daddy used to tell stories about men like you, Zeke. Men who built something from nothing, only to have it snatched away. History has a way of repeating," Ezekiel said softly, "until somebody breaks the cycle." Outside again, he passed the local barber shop, where men gathered daily to debate everything from politics to sports. Today, their attention was focused on a phone showing a YouTube commentary about him. "Man's got papers, though," one barber argued, clippers buzzing in his hand. "You saw them spill out. Ain't no crazy person carrying around bank documents from the 60s. "Could be fake," another man countered. "You can fake anything these days." Ezekiel continued home, the weight of eyes and whispers following him. His phone buzzed. Mariah's number. "Mr. Carter," her voice was excited but controlled. "I have someone you need to meet. My cousin David. He's in law school. He knows about cases like yours, about historical property rights. Bring him, Ezekiel said, checking his surroundings before continuing. Tonight, after dark. Use the back entrance. Hours later, as evening settled over the city, Mariah arrived with David Wright, tall, serious-faced, wearing wire-rimmed glasses that caught the lamplight. He carried a leather messenger bag stuffed with legal texts. "Mr. Carter," David said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been studying similar cases in my property law class. The precedents are fascinating, especially regarding hidden ownership and historical documentation." Ezekiel studied the young man's eager face. "You understand the risks? Getting involved in this?" "With respect, sir," David adjusted his glasses. "Some fights are worth the risk. What happened to you? It's not just history. It's happening right now, in different ways. Someone needs to stand up." Ezekiel nodded slowly, then moved to his bed, a simple cot pushed against the wall. He knelt, joints creaking, and pulled up a loose floorboard. From the space beneath, he withdrew a battered steamer trunk, its brass fittings dulled with age. "Been keeping these safe," he said, working the lock. "Waiting for the right moment, the right people." The trunk's hinges groaned as he opened it. Inside, organized with meticulous care, lay dozens of stock certificates, their gold seals still bright. Bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Photographs, receipts, bank statements, a paper trail spanning decades. David's eyes widened as Ezekiel began laying the documents on his small kitchen table. "These are original Series A stock certificates," he breathed, handling one with reverence. "And these letters, their correspondence between the original board members? Thomas wasn't careful in the beginning," Ezekiel explained. "Thought he could trust his words to paper because nobody would believe me anyway. Didn't think I'd keep everything." Mariah picked up a photograph, Ezekiel and Thomas Halston standing before the original vault. "The key," she said. "The one you showed at the bank. It's right there in the picture." David was already taking notes, his legal pad filling with cramped writing. "Mr. Carter, these documents, they're not just evidence. They're a timeline of systematic theft. With these, we could not only prove your ownership, but expose decades of corporate fraud." "That's why they're scared," Mariah realized. "The current board, they must know these papers exist somewhere. That's why they acted so fast to discredit you." In the polished conference room on the 30th floor of Chase's corporate headquarters, Charles Halston stood at the window, his reflection hard and cold against the Atlanta skyline. Behind him, 6 lawyers in expensive suits sat around a gleaming mahogany table, papers spread before them like battle plans. "This old fool thinks he can walk in here and threaten everything we've built?" Charles's voice was quiet, but edged with steel. He turned, his tailored suit catching the late afternoon light. At 61, he carried himself with the dangerous grace of a man used to crushing opposition. Richard sat at his uncle's right hand, trying to mirror Charles's composure, but failing to hide his nervous energy. "He's got some kind of papers," he said, fingers drumming on the table. "And that key." "Papers can be discredited," Charles cut him off. "Keys can be copied." He nodded to Sandra Porter, their head of legal affairs, who stood and adjusted her glasses. "We've already drafted a comprehensive strategy," she said, distributing folders to everyone present. "First, we file for an emergency restraining order citing harassment and threatening behavior. Judge Matthews owes us several favors. He'll sign it without question." Charles picked up his folder but didn't open it. "And the media angle?" Another lawyer, James Wilson, cleared his throat. "We've got 3 major financial columnists ready to write pieces questioning his mental competency. They'll focus on his appearance, his age, the apparent absurdity of his claims. We're also arranging interviews with psychiatric experts who'll suggest possible dementia without actually examining him." "Good," Charles said, finally taking his seat at the head of the table. What about his background? I want everything. Parking tickets, overdue library books, anything we can use. A younger lawyer tapped his tablet. We've found some interesting angles. He's lived in the same rundown apartment for decades, despite supposedly having hidden wealth. We can spin this as evidence of mental decline. There's also a minor tax dispute from 1983 we can blow up into something bigger. Richard leaned forward, his expression eager. What about that young teller who helped him? Mariah something? Daniels, Charles supplied, his tone flat. She's been with the bank 8 months. Clean record, good performance reviews. Until now. Sandra Porter made a note. We can handle her through normal channels. A few documented performance issues, some customer complaints that somehow got misfiled until now. Standard procedure. Charles stood again, pacing slowly around the table. I want everyone clear on the narrative we're pushing. A confused, elderly man makes outlandish claims about owning a major bank. He harasses staff, disrupts business, and needs help. Not encouragement. We're the responsible party here, protecting both him and our customers from his delusions. The lawyers nodded, but one, Peter Hayes, fresh from Harvard Law, shifted uncomfortably. What if he does have legitimate documentation? Those papers people saw. Charles fixed him with a stare that made the young man shrink back. Mr. Hayes, do you know what my grandfather taught me about power? It's not about what's true. It's about what people believe is true. And people believe what we tell them to believe. Richard smirked, gaining confidence from his uncle's certainty. The old man looked like a homeless person. Who's going to believe him over us? Exactly, Charles said, but his expression remained serious. Still, I want every document from the founding period secured. Anything that might support his claims needs to be properly archived. Sandra, your team will handle that personally. Sandra nodded, understanding the unspoken directive. We'll need after-hours access to the records room. No witnesses, no paper trail. Use the service entrance, Charles instructed. And any security footage from those areas will unfortunately be lost due to technical difficulties. The meeting continued as they refined their strategy. Media contacts were confirmed, legal documents were signed, and plans were set in motion. Charles watched it all with the detached interest of a chess master moving pieces across a board. What about social media? Richard asked. Those videos are still spreading. A media consultant who had been quiet until now spoke up. We're deploying counter-narratives through our network of influencer accounts. Memes making fun of him, posts questioning his story, that sort of thing. By tomorrow, he'll be just another internet joke. Charles checked his watch. A Patek Philippe worth more than most people's homes. I want the restraining order filed within the hour. Begin the media rollout at dawn. By this time tomorrow, anyone supporting his claims should feel foolish for having believed him. The lawyers gathered their materials, filing out with practiced efficiency. Richard lingered, watching his uncle return to the window. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of red. Uncle Charles, he said, trying to sound casual. What if he doesn't back down? Even with all this? Charles didn't turn from the window. His reflection showed no expression as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. If he keeps pushing, bury him. Richard nodded eagerly, already imagining the old man's defeat. But he missed the look in his uncle's eyes, a cold, hard gleam that spoke of experiences Richard had never known, of battles fought in ways his nephew couldn't understand. The younger Halston left, closing the door behind him. Charles remained at the window, watching darkness claim the city. In the gathering night, his reflection seemed to float against the glass, a ghost of power and privilege haunting the heights of the world he'd inherited and protected through any means necessary. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, eyes fixed on the distant streets, where Ezekiel Carter dared to challenge what generations of Halstons had built. The city lights began to twinkle below, each one a star in the empire he commanded, an empire he would protect at any cost. 2 days later, sunlight streamed through the bank's glass doors as Ezekiel Carter approached, transformed. Gone were the ragged clothes and frayed sack. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. At his side walked Mariah Daniels, her head held high despite the stares from her co-workers. David Wright flanked Ezekiel's other side, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with documents. Behind them, 2 distinguished lawyers in dark suits completed the group. The security guards who had thrown him out days before now stood frozen, uncertain. One reached for his radio, but Ezekiel simply nodded at him and walked past, his dignity radiating like a force field that kept everyone at bay. The lobby fell silent. Customers stopped mid-transaction. Tellers' hands hovered over keyboards. Richard Halston emerged from his office, his face reddening at the sight of the man he'd humiliated now returning like a king to his castle. "Mr. Halston," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying across the marble floor, "I believe we have some business to discuss." Richard tried to maintain his authority. "You're not welcome here. There's a restraining order, which has been temporarily stayed by Judge Williams," one of the lawyers interrupted, producing a court document. "We have every right to be here." David opened his briefcase on the nearest desk, removing folders with practiced efficiency. "We have complete documentation proving Mr. Carter's ownership claims," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "All notarized, all legally binding." Mariah stepped forward, addressing her fellow employees. "Everything you're about to see is real. Every document, every signature, every seal. This is the truth they tried to hide." Ezekiel moved to the center of the lobby, where days ago he had stood in rags. Now he commanded the space, his presence drawing everyone closer. He lifted the first document, a yellowed but pristine deed dated 1963. "This bank was founded with my money," he said, his voice strong and clear. "My grandfather's savings, my father's inheritance, and every dollar I had earned until then. Thomas Halston was my partner, not my superior. We built this together." Customers pressed closer, phones recording every moment. Through the windows, news cameras captured the scene, their lights adding to the drama. Richard Halston's face grew paler with each new document Ezekiel presented. "Share transfer agreements," David explained, laying out more papers. Mr. Carter maintained ownership through a complex trust system. Even when they thought they'd pushed him out, he was quietly buying back control through shell companies and proxy investors. One of the lawyers pointed to a particularly important document. "This trustee letter from 1975 proves Mr. Carter never relinquished his founding stake. The signatures are verified by 3 separate experts." An elderly customer stepped forward, squinting at Ezekiel. "I remember you," she said suddenly. "You used to have an office here, back when I was a girl. My daddy said you were the smartest businessman he knew." Ezekiel smiled gently. "Your father was James Monroe. He had an auto repair shop on Auburn Avenue." "That's right." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "They told us you'd sold out and moved away." "They told a lot of people a lot of things," Ezekiel replied, his voice carrying no bitterness, only truth. Mariah organized the documents into clear view on the marble counter. Bank statements showing original deposits, property deeds used as collateral, insurance policies listing Mr. Carter as primary beneficiary. The evidence is overwhelming. The crowd grew larger as word spread. Customers who had laughed at Ezekiel days before now pressed forward to shake his hand. Bank employees who had dismissed him stood awkwardly at their stations, shame visible on their faces. Richard Halston retreated to his office, frantically calling upstairs. The security guards shifted uncomfortably, no longer certain who they were supposed to protect. David laid out the final piece of evidence, the original bank charter, its gold seal still bright after all these years. Mr. Carter's signature is right here, alongside Thomas Halston's. Equal partners, equal owners. A spontaneous applause broke out in the lobby. Someone shouted, "Welcome back, Mr. Carter." Others joined in, the sound building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the bank. Ezekiel stood calmly in the midst of it all, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked up at the grand ceiling, remembering the day it was built, remembering the dreams he and Thomas had shared before greed poisoned everything. The elevator dinged, and Charles Halston burst out, his face twisted with rage. He pushed through the crowd, his expensive suit failing to hide the fury in his movements. Behind him, a team of corporate lawyers hurried to keep up. "This is absurd!" Charles shouted, pointing at the documents. "These are forgeries, all of them. This man is nothing but a con artist trying to steal what my family built." The crowd fell silent, watching the confrontation. Charles reached for one of the documents, but Ezekiel's hand shot out, catching his wrist with surprising strength. "Your grandfather taught you many things, Charles," Ezekiel said quietly, "but he never taught you the truth about who really built this bank." Charles yanked his hand away, straightening his jacket. His sneer carried all the privilege and prejudice of generations. "These papers are fake," he declared to the crowd, "and I'll prove it." Charles reached into his briefcase, pulling out a leather folder with the bank's gold emblem. "If you want truth," he announced to the crowd, "here it is." He withdrew a document, its edges crisp despite its apparent age. "A full sale agreement," Charles declared, holding it up for all to see. Dated September 15, 1965. Mr. Carter sold every share he owned to my grandfather for the sum of $50,000. He passed copies to the reporters who had gathered, complete with notary stamps and witness signatures. The mood in the lobby shifted. Phones that had been recording Ezekiel's triumph now turned to capture his apparent downfall. Charles walked the room like a prosecutor before a jury, his confidence growing with each step. "Look at the signatures," he urged, pointing to the bottom of the page. "Compare them to the ones on his so-called proof. Our document examiners have already confirmed. This sale agreement is authentic." Ezekiel studied the paper, his face betraying nothing. But Mariah saw his hands trembling slightly as he held the document. David leaned in close, whispering, "That's impossible. We checked everything." Charles wasn't finished. He produced more papers from his folder. Bank records showing the transfer of funds, letters from Mr. Carter's own attorney confirming the sale, even a newspaper clipping announcing the change in ownership. He laid them out one by one, building his case with the precision of someone who had planned this moment carefully. Reporters began updating their stories. Phones buzzed with notifications as news sites reversed their headlines. "Ownership claim debunked" flashed across screens. The customers who had cheered Ezekiel minutes ago now stepped back, doubt clouding their faces. "Furthermore," Charles continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we have evidence that Mr. Carter has a history of making unfounded claims. In 1972, he tried to assert ownership of a small factory in Memphis. In 1981, he disputed a land deal in Savannah. Each time, the courts threw out his cases." Ezekiel's lawyers huddled together, examining Charles's documents with growing concern. One whispered something to David, who shook his head in frustration. "I think we've all seen enough," Charles announced. Security, please escort these people out. And this time, he added with a cold smile, make sure they understand that criminal charges will follow any further attempts at fraud. The same security guards who had hesitated to stop Ezekiel now moved forward with renewed purpose. The crowd parted, some people taking pictures, others looking away in second-hand embarrassment. The morning's triumph had turned to afternoon ash. Mariah stepped between the guards and Ezekiel. "This isn't right," she protested. "Those documents couldn't have existed. Mr. Carter was still signing bank papers in 1967. I saw them myself." "Young lady," Charles said sharply, "I'd be very careful about making accusations. Your position here is already precarious." The threat in his voice was clear. David quickly gathered their evidence back into his briefcase, his law student mind already racing through possibilities. "We'll fight this," he muttered. "There has to be a way to prove these are fake." But the damage was done. News vans outside were already broadcasting updates about the elderly fraud attempt at the bank. Social media exploded with mocking comments and cruel memes. The same viral spread that had boosted Ezekiel's story now worked against him with brutal efficiency. Ezekiel stood still in the chaos, his dignity somehow intact despite the crushing weight of public humiliation. He carefully straightened his tie, adjusted his suit jacket, and looked Charles directly in the eyes. "Your grandfather," he said softly, so only Charles could hear. "He had a scar on his left hand from a hunting accident. We were there together when it happened, in the spring of '64. The buck that got away, he called it. Funny thing about your sale agreement, it's dated after that accident, but the man in the witness photo has no scar." Color drained from Charles's face, but he recovered quickly. "Get him out of here," he ordered the guards. This time, they didn't need to use force. Ezekiel walked out under his own power, head high despite the cameras, and shouted questions. Mariah and David flanked him protectively, while his lawyers trailed behind, already planning their next move. The afternoon sun felt colder somehow as they reached the street. News reporters swarmed them, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mr. Carter, how do you respond to evidence that you sold your shares? Was this a publicity stunt? Are you prepared for criminal charges?" David tried to shield Ezekiel from the onslaught, while Mariah called for a taxi. The lawyers spoke in hushed tones about injunctions and appeals, but their words sounded hollow against the media circus. Hours later, after declining invitations to stay with either Mariah or David, Ezekiel sat alone in his modest apartment. The suit jacket hung carefully on its hanger, one of the few fine things he owned. The brass key lay on his small table, catching the last light of day through his window. His phone had been ringing non-stop with reporters and talk show bookers, but he let them go to voicemail. The TV in the corner silently played news coverage of his humiliation, his own face looking back at him beneath headlines questioning his sanity and integrity. Ezekiel picked up the key, feeling its familiar weight. Decades of memories lived in its worn surface, memories of hope, betrayal, and patient waiting. The truth was there, encoded in brass and time, if only he could prove it. "You still hold the truth," he whispered to the key, his voice steady despite everything. The words hung in the darkening room, a quiet defiance against the day's defeat. The next morning brought a weak sun through Atlanta's autumn haze. Mariah's small Toyota pulled up outside Ezekiel's apartment building, its blue paint dusty from construction sites she'd passed. David sat in the passenger seat, his laptop balanced on his knees, legal documents spread across the dashboard. "This is it?" Mariah asked, looking at the weathered brick building with its rusted fire escape. "Third floor," David confirmed, gathering his papers. "He's been here 30 years, according to the records." They climbed the narrow stairs, their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and a broken light fixture dangled overhead. On the third floor, they found apartment 3C, its brass numbers tarnished but polished clean. Mariah knocked softly. "Mr. Carter, it's Mariah and David." They heard slow footsteps, then multiple locks turning. Ezekiel opened the door, already dressed in a pressed shirt and slacks despite the early hour. His small apartment was spotless, with stacks of documents organized on every surface. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "I've made coffee." The apartment was small but dignified, like its owner. A single bed sat in one corner, neatly made with a worn quilt. A hot plate and mini-fridge served as the kitchen. But what dominated the space were the papers, boxes and files of them, each labeled and dated. "I've been up all night," David said, setting his laptop on a small folding table, "looking through everything after yesterday's disaster. But I think I found something." He pulled out a thick legal document, its pages marked with yellow sticky notes. Ezekiel poured coffee into mismatched mugs, his movements careful and precise. "Tell me, the restraining order they filed, it's broad, but it has gaps." David flipped through the pages. "They were so focused on keeping you out of the bank buildings, they didn't consider everything. There's nothing in here about safety deposit boxes." Mariah leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," David explained, "that if Mr. Carter has any existing safety deposit boxes at the bank, he still has legal right to access them. They can't deny him that. It would be theft of personal property." Ezekiel set down his coffee cup slowly, his eyes distant. "The box," he whispered. "Sir?" Mariah moved closer. 50 years ago, when I knew Thomas was planning something, I sealed a box." Ezekiel walked to his bed and pulled out a worn leather journal from underneath. "I wrote it down here, the date and number. Box 1857. David typed rapidly on his laptop. The box would still be valid as long as the fees were paid. They were paid in full, permanently, the day I opened it. Ezekiel smiled slightly. "Thomas thought I was being excessive, but I knew someday I'd need it." Mariah picked up the brass key from the table where it lay. "This isn't just a vault key, is it?" "No." Ezekiel took it gently. "It's a master key from when the bank first opened. It opens every old box in the original vault. Thomas had one, and I had one. He thought he got both when he pushed me out, but—" He held up the key. "Some things you keep close." David was still typing. "According to bank regulations, they have to honor the original contract on safety deposit boxes. They can't deny access without a specific court order, which they don't have." "What's in the box?" Mariah asked. Ezekiel ran his thumb over the key's teeth. "Truth," he said simply. "Papers I put away when I first suspected Thomas was turning against me. The original bank charter with both our signatures. Proof of my initial investment. And photographs. So many photographs of us together, building the bank." "Including ones showing Thomas's scar?" David asked, remembering yesterday's revelation. "And ones from before it." Ezekiel nodded. "Dated and stamped by the photographer's studio. Proof their documents are forged." Mariah started pacing the small room. "We need to get to that box before they realize this loophole exists. They'll try to block it as soon as they figure it out." "We'll need witnesses," David said, "and video evidence of everything. They might try to claim we planted something in the box." Ezekiel stood straighter, energy flowing back into his frame. "I've waited 50 years to open that box again. Every morning, I'd wake up and tell myself, not today, but soon. Now, it's today." They quickly formed a plan. David would bring 2 law school colleagues to witness and document everything. Mariah would take a personal day from work. She had enough sick time saved up. They'd arrive separately, meet in the bank lobby, and proceed together. "They'll try to stop us," Mariah warned as she helped Ezekiel put on his suit jacket. "Richard will be furious." "Let him be," Ezekiel said calmly. "Fury makes men sloppy." My patience has outlasted their arrogance for 50 years. It can last one more day. David packed his briefcase with relevant laws and regulations, ready to cite them if needed. Mariah checked her phone's camera settings, ensuring she could record everything clearly. Ezekiel stood by his window, key in hand, looking out at the city he'd helped build. "Ready?" Mariah asked, her hand on the doorknob. Ezekiel slipped the key into his pocket and straightened his tie. The morning sun caught his face, highlighting the determination in his eyes. Yesterday's defeat had faded, replaced by the steady resolve that had carried him through decades of waiting. "Ready?" he said, and led them out into the morning light. The peach tree branch sat quiet in the late morning sun, its granite facade gleaming. Unlike the downtown location, this older building still had its original architectural details, carved columns and brass fixtures that spoke of a different era. The same era when Ezekiel had first walked these marble floors as an owner, not a supplicant. They arrived separately as planned. David and his two law school colleagues, Maria Chen and James Taylor, waited on a bench outside, pretending to review case files. Mariah parked around the corner, her hands shaking slightly as she checked her phone's battery one last time. Ezekiel arrived last in a cab, stepping out with deliberate dignity. The lobby was less crowded than downtown, mostly elderly customers doing their weekly banking. A few heads turned as their group assembled, but there was none of the previous day's hostility. This branch felt frozen in time, its dark wood panels and high ceiling creating an atmosphere of hushed respect. "Remember," David whispered, "they have to honor the box access. It's federal law." Ezekiel approached the main counter, his posture straight despite his years. The young clerk looked up, her nameplate reading Susan. "Good morning," Ezekiel said, placing his driver's license and the brass key on the counter. "I need to access a safety deposit box." Susan picked up the ID, then looked at the strange old key with confusion. "Sir, our safety deposit boxes use modern keys. This is an original master key," Ezekiel explained patiently, "for box 1857. It's been in continuous holding since 1963. Susan typed on her computer, frowning slightly. That's in the old vault section. Let me get Mr. Peterson, our branch manager." They waited as she disappeared into a back office. Mariah shifted nervously, her phone ready in her pocket. James and Maria positioned themselves casually near the entrance, watching for any attempts to interfere. "Mr. Peterson emerged, a balding man in his 50s who carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone who'd survived multiple corporate restructurings. He studied Ezekiel's ID and the key. "This is unusual," he said slowly. "The old vault hasn't been accessed in years. But if you have proper ID and the key—" He checked his computer again. "Yes, box 1857 is still listed as active. Fees paid in perpetuity." "Then you must allow access," David said quietly, stepping forward with a copy of the relevant banking regulations. "Under federal code." Yes, Peterson waved him off. "I know the law. Please, follow me." They walked through a door marked Private, down a corridor lined with newer safety deposit boxes. At the end, another door opened to reveal an older vault, its thick steel door bearing the original bank's logo. "The mechanism still works," Peterson said, almost apologetically. "We maintain it for historical value, but hardly anyone has boxes down here anymore." The vault door swung open with a soft hiss. Inside, the air felt different, cooler, heavy with history. Brass-faced boxes lined the walls, their numbers stamped in fading black paint. 1857, Ezekiel said softly, walking directly to it. His fingers traced the numbers as if greeting an old friend. Mariah had her phone out now, recording openly. Peterson started to object, But David smoothly interrupted. Federal banking regulations permit documentation of personal property access, sir. The key slid into the lock with a perfect fit. 50 years melted away as Ezekiel turned it, the mechanism clicking exactly as he remembered. Peterson helped him remove the heavy box and carry it to a private viewing room. "I'll be outside if you need anything," Peterson said, closing the door behind him. Ezekiel sat at the small table, the box before him. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The others gathered close, watching, recording. Inside, protected by waxy paper, lay a leather folder stamped with the bank's original seal. Ezekiel opened it carefully. The charter's paper had yellowed, but the ink remained clear and dark, 2 signatures side by side, Thomas Halston and Ezekiel Carter, dated April 15, 1963. "Look," Mariah whispered, pointing to the ownership percentages clearly listed. Carter, 51%, Halston, 49%. Beneath the charter lay a stack of letters, all in Thomas Halston's distinctive handwriting. David began reading them aloud, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Dear Ezekiel, the additional funds you've provided have saved us from certain collapse. I acknowledge your majority stake and commit to repaying—" He moved to the next letter. "Your investment in the new branch has exceeded expectations. As agreed, your ownership share remains controlling." Ezekiel lifted out a manila envelope filled with photographs. Images of 2 young men, one black, one white, standing proudly before their bank. Thomas Halston's face, smooth and unscarred in the earlier photos, then marked by the distinctive scar from a car accident in later ones, each photo dated and stamped by professional studios. The same scar their forged documents claim he had 10 years earlier, Maria said, making notes. More papers emerged: loan agreements, profit-sharing contracts, even newspaper clippings from the bank's founding that mentioned both men's names, articles that had mysteriously vanished from public archives. Ezekiel's hands shook as he held up the charter, its golden seal catching the fluorescent light. Mariah zoomed her phone camera in close, capturing every detail, every signature, every official stamp and notation. 50 years, Ezekiel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. 50 years I've waited to hold this again. He looked up at his allies, his eyes bright. Thomas thought he could erase me. But paper remembers. Paper doesn't forget. That afternoon, downtown Atlanta hummed with anticipation. Word had spread fast. Something big was happening at the main Chase branch. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes raised like metal sunflowers, tracking the story instead of the sun. Pedestrians gathered behind hastily erected barriers, cell phones raised to capture whatever might unfold. Ezekiel stood on the sidewalk, the leather folder tucked securely under his arm. Gone was any trace of the raggedy man they'd mocked days before. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his silver tie catching the afternoon light. Beside him, Mariah and David flanked him protectively, while their legal team, now grown to 6 attorneys, formed a professional phalanx. "You ready?" Mariah asked softly. Ezekiel nodded, his expression serene. "Been ready for 50 years." They moved toward the entrance. Security guards stepped forward, then back, uncertain. The restraining order still technically stood, but the media presence made them hesitate. A reporter thrust a microphone forward. "Mr. Carter, is it true you have proof of ownership?" "The truth," Ezekiel said clearly, "speaks for itself." The lobby fell silent as they entered, customers and staff freezing in place. Richard Halston burst from his office, his face mottled red. "You can't be here!" he shouted. "Security!" Actually, one of Ezekiel's lawyers stepped forward. "We have a court order superseding the restraining order, given new evidence." She held up a document. "We're here to meet with bank leadership. Now." Richard's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, his face darkening. "Yes, Uncle. They're here." A pause. "Yes, sir." He pointed toward the conference room, trying to maintain his sneer, but failing. "Fine. 10 minutes." They filed into the large corner conference room with its wall of windows overlooking the city. Cameras pressed against the glass from outside, their flashes creating a stuttering light show. Inside, Charles Halston already sat at the head of the table, his expensive suit a armor of privilege. "This is harassment," Charles said flatly. "Whatever forged nonsense you've drummed up." "Forged?" Ezekiel's voice carried quiet authority as he placed the leather folder on the table. "Like the documents you created? The ones showing your father with a scar he didn't get until 1975? He carefully opened the folder. "Or perhaps you mean these originals, stored in your own bank's vault for 50 years? Charles's lawyers leaned forward, their expressions shifting from dismissal to concern as they studied the charter. One whispered urgently in Charles's ear. Charles waved him off. That can't be." "The original charter," Ezekiel continued, his voice carrying to the cameras pressing against the glass, "showing 51% ownership. Witnessed, notarized, and registered with the State Banking Commission." He laid out the letters one by one. "Your father's own words, acknowledging my role, my investment, my ownership. The real story of this bank's founding." Richard grabbed for one of the letters, but Mariah was faster, sliding it away. "Careful," she said. "These are legal evidence now." More whispers between Charles and his lawyers. One stood up, gathering his briefcase. "Mr. Halston, I cannot continue to represent you in this matter." He walked out, followed by two others. Charles's face had gone from red to pale. "You think you can walk in here and take what my family built? After all these years? Your family?" Ezekiel's voice carried decades of patient strength. "Your father built nothing alone. My money saved this bank 3 times in its first year. My connections brought in our first major accounts. My work laid this foundation." He placed the photos on the table. "And your father knew it, until greed poisoned his mind." The remaining lawyers huddled, papers rustling. Outside, the crowd had grown, pressing against the windows. Phones live-streamed every moment. Richard paced, tugging at his collar. Charles stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. "This is all lies! Fake documents! He's trying to steal!" His hand shot out for the charter. Several things happened at once. Mariah's phone captured his movement. Security cameras whirred, and 2 police officers who had been quietly summoned stepped into the room. "Mr. Halston," one officer said firmly, "please step back from the table." "This is my bank," Charles shouted, spittle flying. "You can't." "Actually," the second officer said, producing handcuffs, "we have a warrant regarding attempted fraud and falsification of banking documents. The FBI's white-collar division has been quite interested in some recent discoveries." Charles looked wildly around the room, finding no allies. His remaining lawyers stared at the floor. Richard backed away, hands raised. The officers moved forward. "Charles Halston, you're under arrest for attempted fraud, falsification of federal banking documents, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The handcuffs clicked shut. "You have the right to remain silent." Ezekiel remained seated, watching calmly as Charles was led away, shouting threats and promises of retribution. The charter lay open before him, its truth finally free after 50 years of darkness. Through the windows, the crowd erupted in cheers as Charles emerged in handcuffs. Phones recorded his perp walk to the waiting police car. Reporters shouted questions. The afternoon sun caught the bank's brass letters above the door, and for the first time in decades, they seemed to shine with their original promise. Richard slumped in a corner chair, all arrogance drained away. Mariah carefully gathered the documents, returning them to their folder while David coordinated with the remaining legal team. The truth had come home at last. Morning sunlight streamed through the hotel conference room's tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above the sea of eager reporters. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a forest of microphones, boom poles, and lighting rigs. The air hummed with anticipation and the soft murmur of journalists checking their equipment. At precisely 9 o'clock, Ezekiel Carter stepped onto the small raised platform, flanked by Mariah and David. His presence commanded immediate attention, his dignified bearing a stark contrast to the chaos of the press corps. He wore a deep navy suit, his silver tie matching the distinguished gray at his temples. The sack that had once held his precious documents now rested in a display case behind him, a symbol of his journey. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear. The room fell silent. Yesterday marked the end of a 50-year injustice and the beginning of a new chapter in this bank's history. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he gestured to a screen where FBI financial forensics were displayed. Federal investigators have confirmed what I've known since 1963. The Halston family, beginning with Thomas Halston and continuing through his son Charles, engaged in systematic fraud to erase my role as founding partner and majority shareholder. David stepped forward, pointing to specific documents. The investigation revealed decades of forged signatures, backdated contracts, and deliberately altered records. The Halstons exploited the racial prejudices of their era, assuming no one would believe or support Mr. Carter's claims. A reporter's hand shot up. "Mr. Carter, how did you survive all these years without access to your rightful assets?" Ezekiel's eyes crinkled slightly. "I never stopped working. While they thought they'd stripped me of everything, I built quietly. Real estate investments, oil rights, community development projects. I learned patience from my grandmother, who taught me that justice might sleep, but it never dies." Mariah touched his arm gently, then addressed the crowd. "Working with Mr. Carter these past weeks has shown me what true dignity looks like. The same man they mocked in rags now stands before you as exactly who he always was. A brilliant businessman and a man of unshakable character." Another reporter called out, "Can you confirm the arrests this morning?" "Yes," David responded, consulting his notes. Richard Halston was arrested at 6 a.m. at his home. Additional charges of conspiracy and evidence tampering have been added to both his and Charles Halston's cases. The FBI has frozen their personal assets pending investigation into decades of financial misconduct. Ezekiel raised his hand for quiet as the room erupted with questions. "The past cannot be changed," he said firmly. "But the future, that we can shape. As of this morning, I have been formally reinstated as majority owner of this institution. My first act will be to transform it into what it was always meant to be, a force for community empowerment." He gestured to a series of charts behind him. "Effective immediately. We're establishing a $50 million fund for small business loans in underserved neighborhoods. We're creating educational scholarships, first-time homebuyer programs, and financial literacy initiatives. This bank was built with the dreams of common people. It's time it served those dreams again." The announcement drew applause from the gathered press. Even hardened reporters found themselves moved by the justice of the moment. A veteran journalist stood, his voice carrying years of cynicism and newfound hope. "Mr. Carter, why didn't you give up? 50 years is a long time to wait." Ezekiel's response came slowly, weighted with half a century of patience. "Because truth doesn't expire. Because my father taught me that a man's dignity isn't in his clothes or his position, but in his character. And because I knew that one day I would walk back into that lobby not as a man they could mock, but as the man I always was. Questions continued for another hour. Reporters pressed for details about the fraud investigation, the bank's future plans, and the dramatic story of the safety deposit box key. Through it all, Ezekiel maintained his composed demeanor, neither gloating nor bitter. As the conference wound down, Ezekiel, Mariah, and David made their way through the hotel's marble corridors toward the bank's main branch. The short walk drew crowds of onlookers, many calling out congratulations or asking for photos. Ezekiel acknowledged them with gentle nods, but kept walking. They paused at the bank's entrance, the same doors through which security had once pushed him. Through the glass, they could see staff gathered in the lobby, their faces a mix of shame and uncertainty. "Ready?" Mariah asked, just as she had the day before. Ezekiel straightened his tie. "Been ready for 50 years, he replied with a small smile. The doors opened. The lobby fell silent. Where once there had been mockery and disdain, now there was only respect. Staff members who had laughed at his ragged clothes now bowed their heads as he passed. The security guards who had manhandled him stood at attention, their eyes downcast. Ezekiel's footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he walked to the center of the lobby. He paused there, looking up at the soaring ceiling, then at the faces around him. No words were needed. The truth had spoken. Justice had awakened, and dignity, patient, unwavering dignity, had triumphed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the executive office's floor-to-ceiling windows, warming the polished mahogany desk where Ezekiel Carter now sat. His weathered sack, the same one that had drawn sneers and mockery weeks ago, rested prominently on the corner of the desk, its frayed edges a testament to years of patient waiting. Ezekiel ran his fingers along the desk's smooth surface, remembering how Thomas Halston had once sat here, smugly certain that no one would ever believe the claims of a black man who'd been wronged. The office still held echoes of old power, but now it breathed new purpose. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mariah entered, carrying a stack of financial reports and wearing her new badge that read Senior Vice President of Community Relations. "The first scholarship applications are already coming in," she said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from him. "People are calling it the Dignity Fund. That wasn't even our idea. The community started it." Ezekiel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dignity. That's what they tried to take from me that day I walked in. Not just my bank, but my dignity." "But you never lost it," Mariah said firmly. "Even when they were laughing, even when security was pushing you out, you had more dignity than anyone in that lobby." He reached for the old sack, gently patting its worn fabric. "My grandmother made this sack for me when I was just starting out. Said a man needs something to carry his dreams in." He chuckled softly. "Never imagined it would carry 50 years of proof instead." Through the open door, they could hear the bustling sounds of the bank lobby below. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Where there had once been cold efficiency and subtle discrimination, now there was warmth and genuine welcome. Employees who had once judged customers by their appearance now greeted everyone with equal respect. "Mr. Carter," Mariah began, then corrected herself. He'd asked her to use his first name. "Ezekiel. I never properly thanked you for trusting me that day. When I called you after hours, you could have hung up, could have assumed I was trying to trap you somehow." He turned from the window to face her. "You showed me something rare that day, genuine concern for justice. Not just sympathy, but a willingness to act." He gestured to her new badge. "That's why you're sitting where you are now." A young clerk appeared at the door with more papers requiring signatures. These were for the new community investment programs, small business incubators, first-time homeowner assistance, financial literacy workshops. Each signature represented another brick in the foundation of what the bank should have been all along. The Halston family built their fortune on stolen dreams, Ezekiel said as he signed. Now we'll build something better on restored ones. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see customers entering the bank. Their faces were different now, hopeful, confident. An elderly woman in a church hat waved up at him, and he waved back. A young man in work boots stood straighter as he approached a teller, no longer afraid of being judged. "We've already approved 15 small business loans this morning," Mariah reported, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "The review board is prioritizing applications from neighborhoods that have never had fair access to capital before." Ezekiel stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline. 50 years ago, he'd stood on these same streets, watching his dream being stolen. Now he stood above them, watching it being reborn. "You know what means the most?" he said quietly. "Not the vindication, not even getting the bank back. It's seeing people walk in here with their heads held high, knowing they'll be treated with respect." A group of young entrepreneurs waited in the lobby, their business plans clutched hopefully in their hands. They weren't wearing expensive suits or carrying designer briefcases, but their dreams were just as valid, their potential just as vast. "We're setting up the scholarship foundation next week," Mariah reminded him. "The board suggested naming it after you." Ezekiel shook his head. "Name it after my grandmother. She taught me that dignity isn't something others can give or take away. It's something you carry inside, like those papers in that old sack." The afternoon light shifted, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. Below, the steady stream of customers continued. Parents opening savings accounts for their children, small business owners seeking guidance, first-time home buyers daring to dream. Sometimes, Ezekiel mused, justice needs time to ripen, like fruit on a tree. You can't rush it, can't force it. You just have to tend it, protect it, and trust that its season will come. Mariah stood beside him at the window, both of them watching the city pulse with life. "And when it does come?" "When it comes," he said, touching the glass lightly. "It feeds generations." The old sack caught the sunlight, its humble threads now gleaming like gold. It had carried his proof through decades of waiting, through mockery and dismissal, through long nights of patience and careful planning. Now it rested on the desk of the office that had always been rightfully his, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of endurance. A child in the lobby pointed up at him, asking her mother who the man in the window was. The mother's response carried clearly through the air. "That's Mr. Carter. He's the owner. He teaches us that justice might take time, but it always comes to those who keep their dignity." Ezekiel smiled at the distant skyline, at the city that had witnessed both his pain and his triumph. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke the words he'd waited 50 years to say, "Dignity restored. Justice served." I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.